now I will introduce our speaker. So I am introducing Kendall DeLyser, who works for American Forest, with the presentation topic today of impacts of forest management on carbon sequestration and storage for climate change mitigation. I'm honored to introduce her because I am currently working on this project with the rest of the Forest Carbon and Climate Program team here at MSU, as well as NIACS, which is the Northern Institute for Applied Climate Science. So Kendall works at American Forest, where she oversees various projects and serves as a technical expert on forest, carbon, and climate change. She's currently leading research and partnerships on forest soil carbon, management impacts and forest carbon, ecosystem carbon, and the role of forests as natural climate solutions. Before joining American Forest, she's worked on a variety of carbon offset projects that focus on research and policy that provide recommendations for a variety of climate smart land use policy. And she also holds a Bachelor in Arts in Environmental Policy from Colorado College. Afterwards, she also earned a double master's in environmental management and a master's in forestry from Duke University. So without further notice, Kendall.
Thank you, Chad. Thanks everyone for joining me here today. I'm really excited to get to talk to you about this great slew of research projects that we have going. As Chad mentioned, some of this work is happening right in your own backyard at MSU. So without further ado, I will take us away. A bit of an agenda for us today, just to give you a sense of what we're going to cover. We'll start off with a quick introduction to who we are, an introduction to American Forests, my organization, and then the rest of our CBM modeling team. We'll spend the bulk of the time really talking about what we're doing. So we will cover our research objectives, an overview of this model that we're using for forest carbon impacts, and then the bulk of the time focusing on the science opportunities that we have in using this model. And we'll wrap up stepping out of the nitty-gritty modeling details and just thinking about why this matters and what the results and the uses of our research will be. So a quick background on American Forests. We are the country's oldest forest conservation organization. We were founded in 1875, and we've been working in the space of forest management ever since. So as an organization, we work to create healthy and resilient forests that deliver essential benefits for climate, for social equity, for water, and for wildlife. And we often work with local or state partners to do this on the ground, and we focus on helping our partners manage their forests to maximize their benefits under these 4 pillars. One of our fastest growing areas of focus, at least for me, is this climate change solutions pillar. So our research in this area is really driven by the relationship between forest management and climate. We know at the most basic level that forests sequester carbon as they grow, and that this helps to slow climate change. But in the climate mitigation and natural climate solutions discussions to date, we have a lot more to say about the carbon impacts of tree planting or conserving forest, because that's all relatively easy to calculate. The carbon impacts of forest management, on the other hand, are trickier to quantify because forest management can mean a lot of different things. And so they're kind of a missing piece in the climate solutions conversations so far. So our goal with this research in our program and this specific project is to provide some more information on what these carbon impacts of management actually are. We're doing this in collaboration with quite a few partners, as you see here in our logo soup kind of slide. We've set up a really great core modeling and research team to help out with this, being led by myself at American Forests with partners at the US Forest Service, the Canadian Forest Service, the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, and your folks at MSU. And we originally assembled this research team to help with 2 different technical assistance grants, both funded through the US Climate Alliance, working with 2 sets of states, starting with Maryland and Pennsylvania, and then adding the Lake states, Minnesota, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And we were then later asked to expand our methodology and our work to Oregon and to California. So we're now really excited to have 7 states that are working with our team. American Forest was approached by all of our state partners to lead this research for them. And we're essentially the only team that's working to use this model in the US at this scale. Now, all of this work comes from a recognition that we can really only measure forest carbon changes associated with lengthening stand rotations in natural climate solutions conversations But land managers we know are using a much larger suite of practices to manage their forests for a range of environmental and economic benefits. So our state partners really need information about the carbon and the economic impacts of this broad suite of forest management practices. And they want to use this in their state forest action plans, in future forest management planning, to develop forest carbon strategies, to use in state climate action plans, to incorporate into greenhouse gas inventories at the state level. So there are a lot of high-level policy and forest management objectives here. And so we're making sure that we prioritize these needs and these objectives from our state partners in all of our work. We're making sure to understand what their questions are about forest management and carbon and climate, addressing their most pressing concerns. We're constantly consulting with our state partners who are mostly DNR staff in various states. And then we're also starting to reach out to other stakeholders in certain projects as we develop all of our modeling scenarios and as we work with them through the whole modeling process so that we can get our state partners the answers that they need for these important policy and management goals. The model we're actually using to do this is the carbon budget model of the Canadian forest sector, or CBM. It was developed by the carbon accounting team of the Canadian Forest Service, which is also the team that's involved in our research collaborative. So we're really lucky to have the foremost experts on the model, the people who built it, working with us to apply a Canadian model in the US, which is a unique science opportunity for us. At its core, the CBM is a model of forest ecosystem carbon dynamics. It's designed for the operational scale, but it's applicable down to the stand level and then up at state, regional, or national levels as well. The model is process-based, so it's a mathematical model that's representing ecological relationships, predicting future relationships, all based on a systems dynamic approach. So thinking about flows of carbon in and out of the ecosystem. The CBM also links to a framework for harvested wood products, which we will be using in our analysis to track the carbon in harvested wood products once they've left the forest, and to track the substitution benefits of these products in construction and in the economy. So this harvested wood products information also gives us a chance to look at the economics of different management scenarios by assessing the economic value of the different products that are coming off the forest. Now this model is spatially referenced, it's not spatially explicit. So results are not meant to be tied to specific plots on the ground somewhere. It's not going to spit out maps of forest carbon across each state, but it does reference types of forest stands through the modeling by using inventory classifiers. So classifiers are what we use to describe various characteristics of the forest. So this can be something like 80-year-old ponderosa pine, or 180-year-old Doug fir, or private land, or state forest land, or any combinations therein. And we can use these same classifiers to filter our results at the end and see what happens to carbon in each one of those groups. So this format is really useful for a state or a regional level analysis where there are lots of different forests and ownership combinations that we'd be interested in. The CBM itself is pretty customizable as a model, and it can model basically anything that we tell it to. So we are using it to compare ecosystem carbon results from custom forest management scenarios by modifying assumptions about everything in this list here. So a single forest management scenario will contain all the management actions or natural disturbances that we expect to occur on the landscape over a given time frame. And each scenario needs specific data on each item in this list. So we can then go through creating alternate management scenarios, ones that differ either from the baseline or from each other, by changing any one of these assumptions. So this is a pretty comprehensive list, and there are lots of different ways that we can tweak the model for these different management scenarios. Now we're also able to feed in state-specific inventory data from FIA to get locally accurate growth and yield curves, which I'll talk more about in a minute. And if we know that there's a certain local management practice that's done in a certain way, we can bring in the data to reflect that too, so that everything is as specific to each state as we can make it. It's important to note that this model is not a predictive one. It's not going to tell us if or when a wildfire or a harvest might happen. We have to code in everything. So we have to tell the model when events will happen. The model will tell us what happens to carbon from each one of those events. We also know there's a lot of interest in future climate change impacts, which the model is not currently built to incorporate. So our team is working on some creative ways to bring those expected climate impacts into the model as well, either through changes in growth, in mortality, or in natural disturbance patterns. So this is a pretty powerful tool, and it can give us some really useful results. But it also means that we have to be careful about how we're parameterizing the model and how we develop our scenarios because it's so customizable. The CBM doesn't really have any training wheels, so it won't tell you if a certain management action doesn't make sense or if the data is being weird. It simply takes what we feed it in, crunch a bunch of numbers, and it spits out some results for us to interpret. So the onus is on us, on our team, to make sure that everything we put into the model and every scenario that we develop is grounded in science and in reality. That's why it's so important that our work is based on the best available science. Now, the CBM itself as a model has over 30 years of science and research behind it by this Canadian carbon accounting team. And it already includes over 200 disturbance types available to use in the model with enough research backing them up that we already have a pretty good idea of what they'll do to forest carbon. So we're off to a great start. We have a lot of options in front of us. The model was also built to follow IPCC reporting guidelines. So it fits into these internationally recognized frameworks, both for ecosystem reporting and for the harvested wood products. We are also continuing a trend of expanding this model and the science to the US. So there was a team at the US Forest Service that used the CBM in the US at smaller scales. They started with case studies in South Carolina and Wisconsin. They moved on to assess just state forest lands in Pennsylvania, and then recently finished up a study of all lands in Vermont. So we're taking their format and their formula and expanding this to multi-state scales. We'll also be catching our results in other studies. We're comparing to both previous and ongoing research related to forest carbon, to climate change, resilience, and management impacts, which is important for ground truthing our results to make sure that they make sense. And this is part of our commitment and really our job to survey the science to fill in these knowledge gaps in the model. We're using this model in the US at greater scales than it's ever been used. And so we definitely need some additional research to make sure that we get it right. As I mentioned on the previous slide, we can tell the model to do whatever we want it to do, as long as we have enough scientific certainty to actually believe the results, or going through that whole modeling process doesn't really make sense. So I told you there are over 200 disturbance types that we can already use with the model, but what about those future climate conditions or different types of thinning or uneven age regeneration techniques? Our team will take on those questions. We'll review what's already been published about these practices until we have enough confidence in the data to code this into the model. Now, there may also be certain practices or questions where we can't really find enough data to be confident, and that in and of itself is a really important result, that there are still questions about forests and carbon that need more research before we can include them in this type of a modeling project. So let's look at a few examples of how we're approaching this science in developing our model. As you see from this diagram, the CBM takes a lot of data inputs, and it's inherently designed to use Canadian data. The Canadian Forest Service, the Canadian Forest Inventory is set up quite differently from ours. So one good science opportunity is using our own FIA data and reformatting it for the forest inventory in the model, and using it to create these volume age curves or yield curves. We also need to pull in state-specific natural disturbance, land use change, and harvest data. And anywhere that we need more information on management impacts, like for any practices we want to model that aren't already in those 200 plus available to use, we also need to review the science to essentially build that practice from scratch in the CBM, which we've done for a few disturbances. So for including the impacts of climate change, we need data on projected future climate impacts in a format that we can pull into the model as it relates to these other data inputs above. And I'll get to all of this in due time a little bit later on. Now, our data needs are the same for each one of those projects that we have, each of the four. But since we've gotten the furthest with our Maryland and Pennsylvania project, it was the first project we started with, the examples I'm going to give you from here on out are specific to that project. So for our forest inventory for Maryland and Pennsylvania, we used the RFIA package to process the inventory data. we pulled forest land area from FIA's most recent inventory cycle from 2013 to 2019. We used a few classifiers to help us filter and to organize our inventory. So we filtered things by state and state unit, by ownership, by forest type group, and by stocking class code. Since the inventory doesn't come from all in the same year, we applied a temporally indifferent estimate to weight each annual panel equally and create one large periodic inventory. So we could essentially pool all the panels together and treat them as if they'd come from the same year. We then use this equation or a version of it to estimate the area for each combination of classifiers or those conditions K. This equation and others that I'll show you are simplified versions of what we used. There's a lot of complexity in deciding, for example, whether an entire FIA plot meets some of our classifier conditions if its subplots are actually classed as different forest types or different stocking codes. So think of these as guidelines to give you a sense of the important factors for each data input as we process them. Now, the forest inventory is relatively easy to put together, but the yield curves were more difficult since our inventory system returns to each plot about every 5 years for Maryland and Pennsylvania. So we don't have annual growth increment data from FIA plots from the same plots over time. Instead, we take volume ratio estimates, cubic meters per hectare by forest type group and by stocking class as our two classifiers, and we estimate yield over time for 5-year age class intervals. With this data, we then fit a couple different nonlinear growth models to predict this volume over time. Where we had a large enough sample size, we used a Gompertz growth model, which we prefer because it doesn't assume asymptote symmetry. So that means the beginning and the end of the curve don't have to approach that steady state. They don't have to level off at the same rate, which is more reflective of how trees actually grow over time, especially at the end of their life when they're kind of slowly reaching their steady state. Where we didn't have a large enough sample size, for Gompertz, we used a regular logistic growth model. And this happened most often for rare or non-native forest types in the region. And in those same cases, we also increased our sample size by pulling plot level data from anywhere within EPA level 2 ecoregions that overlapped with each state. So the end result is a set of yield curves like the one in this panel. They're sorted by forest type and by stocking class over the time period of our model. Now, once we'd established our inventory and our yield curves, the next big data task is to pull together all of the disturbance events for the model, the really big and important stuff. Now, the CBM uses the term disturbance to mean everything happening in the forest. So from natural disturbances to land use change and harvest events or other management activities like prescribed burns. Now, we pulled natural disturbance data from the Landfire Historical Disturbance Data Set, which provides essentially a 10-year average of disturbance rates from 2007 to 2016. Now, this data set takes reported info on mechanical and natural disturbances as reported in various public sources. So it's a good compilation of data into one unified data set. We actually tried using a few different data sources that focus on different disturbances before turning to the Landfire data set, and we had trouble getting them to agree. So going with this one consistent data set at least gives us more certainty about the consistency of the natural disturbance data in our model. We filtered out all of the mechanical disturbances in this data set, which are basically harvests and thinnings, because we have dedicated harvest data from elsewhere. So we're really just trying to pull out the natural disturbances from Landfire. And when we did this, then the most common ones for Maryland and Pennsylvania are low intensity fire, which includes prescribed fire and low intensity wildfires. And then we have insects and wind throw. Now, for land use change disturbances, we pulled forest loss and gain data from NLCD with a static comparison of 2001 versus 2016. Now, NLCD can often misclassify clear cuts or other kind of harvest activities as forest loss in consecutive versions of the data set, even if the forest has since been reestablished, just because the spectral signatures don't register as still forest. So we chose this longer time period from 2001 to 2016 to try to control for those immediate changes in spectral signature. Now, on average, both states lost more forest cover than they gained over this period, mostly to development, which is not really a surprise. And we again used the classifiers of forest type group and ownership to help us filter this data. We incorporate the historical data from each of these data sets in a kind of spin up period to calibrate the model. And then we're using the annual averages from each of these for our forward-looking baseline. Now, given the prevalence of low-intensity fire as a natural disturbance across the landscape, we actually had to build in our own version of that disturbance for the model. And recall those 200 plus disturbance types that are available for use in the model. Low-intensity fire isn't one of them. Most of the fire events in the stock version of the CBM have to do with catastrophic stand-replacing giant wildfires. But since that's not really what we see in Maryland and Pennsylvania, we needed to customize our own low-intensity fire disturbance. So disturbances in the CBM are comprised of three parts. We have a disturbance event, a disturbance matrix, and a transition rule. So the disturbance event is the code telling the model that a certain disturbance will happen in a given year on a given area or a proportion of our inventory. The disturbance matrix tells the model what happens to carbon when it enacts that disturbance event. So this is where we track the movement of carbon between the different ecosystem pools into the atmosphere or into harvested wood products if it's relevant. And you see all the pools that the CBM uses in this figure here. There are a lot of them to keep track of. So a lot of different movements that we can look at. Now, lastly, for this disturbance, a transition rule then tells the model what to do with that area or proportion of the inventory that it just disturbed. It can be things like reset the stand age, but keep the forest type the same, or stand age stays the same, keep on growing, things like that. So our work to parameterize a low intensity fire disturbance was really focused on creating that disturbance matrix. So we'd know how much fuel and therefore how much carbon was affected by the burn. And this is because we know there's much less carbon affected from a low intensity fire than from a stand replacing wildfire. And that's why we need a different disturbance matrix for each type of fire. So we conducted a lit review of the impacts of prescribed fire on available fuels in Maryland and Pennsylvania, or in the kind of surrounding area. We focused on prescribed fire because it's an important management tool in both states, and because it's more well-studied than the impacts of low-intensity wildfires, which you can't really control for in an experiment like you can a prescribed burn. So we focused on data relating to the immediate consumption of different fuel size classes, like 1-hour fuels, 10-hour fuels, and then the subsequent accumulation of more woody debris in the dead organic matter pools of the forest as a result of things that were killed but not totally consumed by the fire. We mapped the different fuel size classes to the appropriate CBM pools, and then kept the same proportion of gases released from the fire that the CBM uses for its wildfire disturbances. So the composition of the gases released from a low intensity fire is maybe slightly different than the wildfire gas releases, but not in a statistically significant way. It's often less than a 1% difference from the few studies that we could find. So we went through the same process of developing a disturbance matrix with a lit review for a couple other disturbances as well, the main natural disturbances that we found from land fire. So we created a generic low intensity insect and disease disturbance because land fire often doesn't distinguish between them and doesn't specify what kind of insect or disease is hitting the landscape. And then we created one for animal browse, which primarily affects regeneration and is a big concern for our state partners in Maryland and Pennsylvania. So after the natural disturbances and the land use change data, then the last type of disturbance event to pull into the model are all of the management events. Now, these can incorporate both harvest and other practices like prescribed burning or planting. But however, since we already have data on those other practices from other sources, we're really focusing in here on the harvest events. So harvest events are not really as easy to parse from geospatial data because we need not only the area disturbed, but also the volume of material removed, the amount of material that's left on site, stuff you can't easily get from a satellite image. So we turned back to FIA data to estimate the volumetric removals for all of our harvest events in the model. Now this volumetric removal data is estimated over the two inventory time periods, 2007 to 2012, and then 2013 to 2019. And we again used a temporally indifferent estimator, just like in our inventory. Once we had this volumetric removal data, we converted it to carbon removals by applying the proportions of hardwood and softwood material in the total removals and using their specific gravities to convert from volume to biomass to carbon. And we pulled these numbers from various Forest Service reports, and we completed these calculations by forest type group, since that's how those reports are organized, and we know that forest type group is an important classifier for our model. Now, once we had the total volume of carbon removed from these FIA plots, we then had to attribute it to various harvest practices. So in consultation with our state partners, we developed these averages of harvest intensity for the 5 most common management practices used in each state, ranging from around 90% harvest removal for clear cuts down to about 30% for thinning. Charlie Canham published a paper in 2013 that identifies the average likelihood of a given FIA plot to be harvested, and it tracks the average harvest intensity in those plots. So we can map the average harvest intensities from Canham to the harvest intensities from our state partners, and therefore assume the average likelihood that a given management practice is happening in each state. And we can then use those proportions, those likelihoods, to attribute carbon removals to each one of those practices. Now, this works across all ownerships, which is an especially important step for eastern states like Maryland and Pennsylvania, where the majority of the forest is privately owned and typical management practices are really not very well documented or understood. But since this also happens on state lands, we're corroborating this data with state forest management plans and other planning documents to make sure that we're on the right track there too. So all of the work that I just described, all of this data wrangling, is really to parameterize the baseline of current management and natural disturbances. And we're running this baseline over 150 years. But as you can see from this list, there are a lot more scenarios that we're running for Maryland and Pennsylvania. And each one of them presents its own unique science challenge. Now, this list, all of these practices are representative of the broad range of management options used for multiple environmental and economic benefits in forest management. And these are a good representation of the ones that our state partners are most curious about from a carbon and harvestable products perspective. So we're really glad to be able to incorporate such a variety of scenarios in the model. Now, note that a lot of these things are not done in the forest because of carbon, but they'll be really important for future resilience, adaptation, or habitat. And so it's really important to understand what they might do for carbon as well. Now, some of these scenarios are pretty straightforward, like changes in rotation length. It's a simple matter of changing a harvest age in the model, which is why it's most commonly included in natural climate solutions modeling so far. Other scenarios like restocking understock stands or controlling deer browse are more difficult in the CBM because they deal with uneven age stands in a way that our typical yield curves aren't really built to accommodate. So with restocking, for example, an underplanting can happen in any forest, any age. And you then end up with multiple age cohorts that have to be represented by a single yield curve. So we're actually still working to figure out the best way to handle that with multiple cohorts and one yield curve in the model without ballooning our inventory records to a completely unmanageable size. So a couple other unique scenarios for Maryland and Pennsylvania are this reducing of high grading and estimating future climate impacts. Now, these are important for our state partners, but there's not really one ready to use data source that we can draw from or that they're aware of. So we again have the opportunities to call on the science to help us figure these out. So I'll give you a quick walkthrough of our approach to these scenarios. Now, high grading is an important scenario in Maryland and Pennsylvania for 2 reasons. One is that it speaks to private lands management, which, as we've discussed, is not really all that well documented. It's kind of hard to figure out what's actually going on. And 2, high grading has serious consequences for future forest health and productivity. Well, high grading as a term has a lot of different names. Generally, it follows a cut the best and leave the rest kind of philosophy. The Dictionary of Forestry defines it as the removal of the most commercially valuable trees, usually above a diameter threshold, often leaving a residual stand that's composed of trees of poor condition or species composition. You can imagine that this practice seems enticing for a private landowner who wants good economic return from the current harvest because they're taking out the most commercially valuable trees. But it leaves their forests with suppressed growth, with lower resilience, and really important for our purposes, a depressed ability to sequester carbon over time. You can see in this photo an example of a high-graded forest in Pennsylvania, where a lot of the trees that are left over are smaller, they're not very straight. They seem like they're going to have a hard time continuing to grow into the future. So this has been a topic of concern in forestry for many years. It's a pretty well-known practice on private lands. And so we're modeling this as a scenario with a reduction in high grading over time to see what kind of long-term carbon and resilience gains we might get. But since this practice is really most relevant to private lands, it's difficult to find reliable information on the current rates of practice. But according to a 2010 Pennsylvania private forest landowner survey that was conducted by the Penn State Center for Private Forests, basically for the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, we found this snippet on harvesting behavior from private forest landowners, where the majority of harvesting PFLs chose to only cut a few select large trees. And these PFLs, or private forest landowners, own 42% of private forests that are owned by harvesting PFLs. So in consultation with our state partners, we interpret this only cut a few select large trees to mean a high grade. So higher grades are happening on 42% of the private land that's being actively harvested. Now in our model, we filter this with classifiers for private lands and for hardwood forest types. It's often really the hardwoods that are the most vulnerable at those large merchantable sizes, and they are the ones hardest hit by high grading. So that's what we're focusing on in our Maryland and Pennsylvania model. Now, in addition to the current rates of this practice, we also need data on the growth impacts of these high grade harvests. Our lit review on the subject showed that high grading leads to about a 70% reduction in basal area, shows that future stand growth is reduced to about 18%, and stocking levels are often below 30 or 40% after a high grade. So this combination of information means that we can map this to our average 70% harvest intensity management category, which, if you recall, is what we're terming a seed tree cut. And then when we model this, we transition the stand to a less productive yield curve after the high grade event, because we can see that both the growth and the stocking are impacted by the high grade harvest. So putting these together, we therefore assume that 42% of the so-called seed tree cuts on private lands are actually high grades in the baseline. So we change this in our baseline scenario, and then the reducing high grading scenario is to gradually phase out the acreages of this practice over time in favor of more sustainable harvest practices. Now, the last scenario example that I'll talk through today is about how we're incorporating climate change impacts into the model. As I mentioned before, the CBM wasn't built to use changing climate parameters beyond mean annual temperature, which affects the decay rates that run in the background. However, we do know that climate change is likely to impact forest growth into the future, as well as bring about changes in natural disturbance regimes. So since we have more control in the model over the growth and the disturbance, these are really our 2 points of entry into modeling future climate impacts. So we essentially conducted a really giant lit review to get a sense of what the projected impacts of climate will be in Maryland and Pennsylvania, pulling from published studies with observations or modeling scenarios of their own. And we chose to focus on RCP 8.5 because it represents more extreme climate conditions. It's a high emission scenario. So it's good for illustrating the outside range of climate impacts on our results, but also because sadly, this is looking like more and more like a realistic trajectory for us in the future. And it's becoming more widely used in climate impact studies. The general climate trends that we found for Maryland and Pennsylvania is that these states will get hotter, they'll get wetter, but have much drier summers, and they'll have longer growing seasons over time. So you can think about very naturally how some of this might impact future growth. To try to quantify this, we pulled data from the Climate Change Tree Atlas and the Mid-Atlantic Vulnerability Assessments put together by our partners at NIAX to first compile this qualitative list of quote unquote winners and losers among the common species in our study area under those RCP 8.5 projections. Now, these assessments look at physical site condition requirements and other factors that determine how well or how poorly a species will do under hotter and wetter future conditions. and it provides estimates of a shift in that species range over time. So from this qualitative list, which you can see an example of on the right, we then went to the literature to find quantitative estimates of essentially the percent changes in growth that we'd expect to see for this list of species. Now, with these percent changes in growth for each species, we apply those as modifiers to the base yield curves for each forest type. And we create a library of future climate yield curves that we can pull into the model instead of the base ones that we're using in the baseline. And we have a similar process for the impacts on natural disturbances from climate change. Our lit review shows a potential for increases in mortality from wind and from insects, a higher likelihood of drought in the region, and therefore more conducive conditions for larger wildfires, although there's still not agreement about whether those larger fires will actually happen with greater frequency. As we quantify the increases or the changes in natural disturbance regimes like this, we can easily just apply a percent increase to these, or the acreage, apply that percent increase to the acreage of these disturbances in our model, with the exception of drought, since it's not one of those disturbance events per se that we're modeling. It's not something that came out of the landfire data set. We're working to fine tune our estimates of how this increases vulnerability or mortality to these other disturbance events. Often the trees will be weakened by the drought and then succumb to insects or another disturbance. Now, as is the case with any process-based modeling project, we're using quite an iterative process with lots of problem solving along the way. We've coded all of our work in R and in Python, Jupyter notebooks, so that everything is scripted and it's replicable for each new state that we study. But for anyone who scripted models, you know this is not always a fun process, and there's a lot of experimentation to get the whole thing set up. For Maryland and Pennsylvania, we currently have a functioning model, and we're refining our scenario inputs, working to correctly address those uneven age stand questions and the climate impacts in the model. Now, even through this process, though, we already do have some preliminary results that seem really quite interesting. So for each of those scenarios individually, depending on the scenario, they're showing a 5 to 20% increase over the baseline by the end of the modeling period. Now, this is a really promising start, and we're excited to think about how we might begin to stack some of these practices together into one scenario that looks at the potential for carbon gains from a more comprehensive set of management practices, as would be happening on the ground. No one scenario will really be done in isolation, so we want to combine the afforestation and the high grading and the extended rotations and the silvopasture and everything that's in that list to see what we can really accomplish in each state with concentrated action. It seems, at least, like our state partners should have a pretty powerful arsenal of options to consider for their future climate mitigation goals. Now, just to wrap us up, let's take a step back from all these nitty-gritty project details and information about data and really remind ourselves of why this matters, why my team and I are especially excited by all of these projects. Now, the first is that this is an inclusion of a broad range of forest management scenarios. We know there are lots of forest management approaches in each state that we're working with, and we have the opportunity with this model to consider that broad range that reflects the interests of stakeholders and the various objectives of land managers. It's really important to get beyond just talking about extending rotations in natural climate solutions conversations. And we are really glad that we have the opportunity to provide more info on more of these management practices. We are also glad that we have the opportunity to assess carbon in forests and in harvested wood products and the associated economic benefits. This is really important to take this systems approach to understand the full breadth of forests and the forest sector in each state and their influences on carbon. And the information and the results from this model can be applied in a lot of different ways, and it'll differ depending on the state. As a minimum, we'll all walk away with a better understanding of the climate mitigation potential of forests and the forest sector in each state or region. We can also consider integrating carbon as another management objective into state policies, programs for forests. And we're also hoping to encourage more of an open dialogue about forests and carbon and management in each state more generally, especially for some of our Western states where those conversations have long been quite contentious. And we're certainly encouraging and hopefully enabling the inclusion of forests in state-level climate action planning. Now, for this last bullet, we've seen some different examples of how this can look from our various state partners, from our work with the US Climate Alliance. And so this can run the gamut from just using our scenario results to help identify effective forest management practices to optimize carbon sequestration. We can think about practices that can be prioritized on state lands or incentivized for private landowners where they're appropriate and feasible. We can think about state policies to strengthen and support wood product markets, develop those to keep the incentive strong for healthy forests and sustainable management. We can also use our carbon quantification results and integrate them into greenhouse gas inventories to give each state a better sense of how forests stack up against other parts of the economy. Our ultimate goal with this project is not to be prescriptive of one certain option or scenario above others. Our team is really aiming to provide a comprehensive and a useful data point in the conversations around forests and carbon and climate in each state, and then to help our state partners reach their forest and climate policy goals. So with that, I will stop here. Well, thank you for your time and your attention. And I have plenty of time for questions. I think the easiest thing to do is just to invite you all to unmute yourselves and speak up. I can't see the chat. Chad is monitoring it just in case any questions pop up there, but please feel free to unmute and ask away.
Hi, my name is Lindsay. Thank you for presenting. I had a question about, you were talking about when you are looking at the different disturbance and you're looking at the literature and you're finding the holes in the data. Do you guys keep track of them? Are you guys researching them, or how do you help that get back to the scientific community so we can fill the holes?
Yeah, thanks, Lindsay. That's a great question. Our team is not conducting any additional research for any of the gaps that we identify here, but one of the big deliverables from all of our projects will be kind of a summary report and a series of presentations like this one, where we can also talk about some of the results, and certainly a summary of the lit review that we've done, a summary of the things that we know and the things that we still don't know would be forefront in a lot of that section of the results. So I think the power of working with the Forest Carbon and Climate Program team at MSU is that they have already a really good apparatus and a really good skill set for knowledge sharing and outreach to a lot of different people in the scientific community. So I think we'd be leveraging that network and letting the FCCP team do what they do best in trying to kind of spread that information and make known that there are still data gaps and opportunities for more science in the future.
That's great, thank you.
Do we have any other questions? Well, I guess not. So I like to say thank you, Kendall. If we were in a physical room, I'm sure people would applaud for you at this point. So we'll do that virtually from people's screens or whatever. But I like to thank everybody for joining us. I do not know when the next Hanover seminar is coming, but be on the lookout for sometime in April for the next upcoming seminar. Thank you again, Kendall, and thank you everybody for joining us again.
Yeah, thank you, Chad and Renee, for this opportunity to present. My email address is here. If any of you have questions or thoughts about this work later on, please feel free to reach out. And we look forward to giving you an update when we have more progress on all of our projects.